Greetings all, and welcome to part 2 of my Hasegawa 1/72nd scale out-of-the-box build of their F4U-1A Corsair. In this video, I'll be painting up, adding decals, and preparing 883 for weathering, which is an aircraft from the Black Sheep Squadron and known to have been flown by Gregory Pappy Boyington. So without further ado, let's get into painting this one. For white 883, I decided to start painting the lighter undersides first with a mixture of about 5 parts acrylic flow improver, 2 drops of Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey, and 3 drops of Model Air Insignia White. The reason I mixed in the grey was to make the white a little bit darker to help stimulate shading, and also create a slightly darker base colour that would help with post-shading. I was surprised to find that this mixture applied very easily and became solid after only a few light passes, even though it was a very light colour being applied onto black. I did experience some tip drying though, since I was using a lower pressure to help apply the paint in some finer spaces. Since I'd be painting this aircraft with some pretty heavy weathering, I decided to apply this mix onto the upper surface of the model to create some pre-shading. Recently I got a second airbrush needle as a spare, and I decided to swap this one out just in case any of the tip drying was caused by a slight bend in my older one. Before doing any of the post shading, I decided to apply the rest of the camouflage colours, moving on to the middle colour so that I could do any required touch-ups before doing the shading. This next colour would be a mix of 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 4 drops of Model Air 71109 PRU faded blue. However, this mix was still a bit too thin and spiderwebbed when I tried applying it onto the model, so I ended up adding 2 more drops of paint. I started applying it to the underside of the wings, painting the middle of each panel and then filling the surface in to create a subtle shading effect on the parts of the wings which would fold. I then very carefully painted along the edge where the white ended, keeping the paint mix and pressure low to achieve finer results, and then filling in each panel and building the colour up gradually. I had initially considered masking off this scheme, but I really wanted to have a faded and blended effect between these colours, and I feel like I achieved a really nice result by being very careful. Unfortunately, despite the new needle, I still encountered a lot of tip drying. I was reluctant though to add any retardant and risk the paint becoming too thin and flowing too much, so I decided to keep going and just try clearing the airbrush jams as they came as best I could. Next would be the third and darker upper surface colour, which I created using a mix of 4 drops of Vallejo Flow Improver with 4 drops of Model Air 71295 Flat USN Sea Blue. Once again, I mixed the paint and carefully applied it onto the middle of the panels and then filled it in gradually, in some spots keeping the paint very thin and patchy so that the white saturation would show through, giving it a faded appearance. Since I still had a bit of the sea blue in my airbrush, I added a drop of Insignia White and did some post shading, making the fabric and some random panels a bit lighter than others to achieve some discoloration. I did this effect heavier than I normally would, as looking at photos of Corsairs on Guadalcanal shows that they were very often weather beaten, and the US Navy colours from World War II often noticeably fade when the aircraft were left out in the harsh Pacific theatre weather. Insignia White mixed with a bit of flow improver was then sprayed onto the underside of the aircraft for some post shading, though I left the PRU blue as it was since some of the pre-shading was still showing through it, and this colour would be less exposed to the harsh sun unlike the dark upper side colours. The landing gear didn't seem to have received a very good coverage of the underside colour, so I ended up brush painting it with a few layers of Insignia White, and in between coats I painted the tips of the propeller blades with a base coat of model colour pink. 883 appeared to have a bit of respray under the numbers, so I used a fine brush to paint some roughly square patches of the flat USN Sea Blue, and also repainted some random panels, making it look like the aircraft had received a few new parts. Corsairs on Guadalcanal would occasionally receive newer parts off of other Corsairs that had been damaged in combat or were too unreliable to keep flying, which is, I believe, the fate that 883 would sadly eventually come to. The propeller tips were then given 2 coats of Vallejo Flat Yellow, which thanks to the pink base coat was very easy to apply, and after some final touch-ups of white on the landing gear, I carefully picked out the aircraft's tyres with some thinned down Vallejo model colour flat black using a fine brush. Since all of the airbrushing had been completed, I decided to remove the blue tack from the fuselage and engine, and then did some touch-ups using flat black and interior green around the cockpit area. After a final coat of the flat USNC blue for the patchwork, I once again repaired the antenna and gave the whole model a coat of Vallejo gloss varnish, then down to roughly 1 part flow improver to 1 part varnish, applied in many light passes. The gloss varnish would protect the paint job and also provide a glossy surface to prevent the older decals from silvering. The varnish was given 12 hours to fully cure, and once that had passed, I then cut out 883's decals from the main sheet. As you can see, the decals had yellowed a fair bit, but I decided to still use them and let this play into this Corsair's rougher looking finish. The decals were sat in some hot water for a few seconds, and once they started to lift from the transfer paper, I slid them onto the model using my finger or a brush. Despite the yellowing, the decals went on very easily, with none of them getting damaged or even flaking. Once in place, they all received a coat of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them stick to the model and sink into the surface details. Although decals were included for the walkways, I decided I wanted a rougher finish on them, so I roughly masked off the area where they'd be with some Tamiya masking tape, repaired the antenna which I'd broken again, and painted the walkway markings with a thick application of AK Interactive Dunkel Grau for a rough and faded black textured paint effect. I then did a coat of model colour flat black to darken them up a little bit, and to make them a bit more rough and damaged, I dabbed this paint on in a few spots, and then scratched some of it away gently using a needle and a cocktail stick. The results were pretty good in my opinion, though I could have probably been a bit neater with cleaning up the edges despite the masking. 2 coats of Vallejo matte varnish were then applied to seal in the decals, blend them in with the paint, and give the whole model a dull and more accurate matte finish for this scheme. Once applied, the matte varnish would then be given a full 12 hours to fully cure before moving on to weathering, which we'll be covering in the third and final part of this build series. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the part 3 finale or any of my other videos when they come out. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons who helped me not only fund buying this kit, but also the products I use to make them and all of the time I spend making these videos. Without you guys, it wouldn't be possible to keep doing this, so thank you so much. And if you've got any questions, advice on how I could improve, or any experiences with this kit that you want to share, please be sure to leave it down in the comments below. Part 3 will be coming out hopefully next week, but I'll leave a link to my other Corsair videos if you want to watch some of those in the meantime. But otherwise though, thanks again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.